This was not a war of front lines. It was a war of shadows. The jungle does not announce itself. It doesn't charge. It doesn't roar. It waits. In Vietnam, the enemy didn't arrive with fleets on the horizon or bombers filling the sky. There were no clear borders to defend, no visible armies advancing in perfect formation. Instead, the war lived in the silence between footsteps, in the thick green walls of the jungle, and beneath the soil itself. Every inch of land concealed uncertainty. Every single movement carried the possibility of death. This was the war America could not see. From the air, Vietnam looked deceptively calm. Endless green stretched all the way to the horizon, broken only by rivers winding like veins through the land. But that green hit a battlefield unlike anything the United States had ever faced before. The jungle swallowed sound and it distorted distance. A soldier could hear movement without ever seeing its source. The enemy could be close enough to touch and still remain completely invisible. The jungle wasn't just terrain, it was an accomplice. American troops entered a world where their traditional advantages meant very little. Firepower, technology, air superiority, of them struggled against an enemy who simply refused to fight on predictable terms. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces blended into the landscape, using the jungle as camouflage, shelter, and a weapon. They chose when and where to fight and when to disappear. The war unfolded slowly, relentlessly, and without any clear definition. For the men on the ground, Vietnam was an assault on the senses. The heat pressed down like a physical force, suffocating and constant. Sweat soaked their uniforms within minutes. Their boots sank into mud that never truly seemed to dry. Insects crawled across skin and gear alike. The air itself felt heavy, thick with moisture and decay. And always, there was sound. Radios crackled with broken transmissions. Artillery thundered in the distance. Helicopter blades chopped the air with a mechanical fury. These sounds meant movement, support, survival. But when they stopped, when the jungle went quiet, that's when the fear crept in. Silence was never peace. Silence meant the enemy was near. The Viet Cong didn't just fight on the battlefield. They toggled the battlefield itself. They didn't need to overpower American forces. They only needed to outlast them. Ambushes would erupt without warning. A single rifle shot shattered the stillness. An explosion tore through a patrol, turning a routine movement into chaos in an instant. Then, just as quickly, the enemy vanished. There were no uniforms, no clear front, no certainty. And beneath the jungle floor lay another Vietnam entirely. An underground world of tunnels stretched for miles complete, with living spaces, hospitals, armories, and command centers. Entire units survived underground, emerging only to strike before retreating once more into the darkness. These tunnels neutralized American air power and artillery, allowing the enemy to fight completely on their own terms. To confront this hidden war, America sent men underground. They were called tunnel rats, armed with little more than pistols, flashlights, and raw courage. These soldiers crawled into spaces barely wider than their own shoulders. Every movement forward risked a trap, a blade, or a gun fired at point-blank range. There was no room to turn around, no room to panic, only darkness, sweat, and absolute fear. This was combat stripped of all its glory. Above ground, the war raged on in a different form. Helicopters became the defining symbol of Vietnam. Hueys thundered across the sky, lifting troops into hot landing zones that had been carved out of the jungle by napalm and artillery. Their arrival could mean rescue or the beginning of a firefight. Soldiers learned to read the sound instinctively. A distant rotor could bring hope, or it could bring dread. Air mobility changed warfare, but it couldn't eliminate the uncertainty. Napalm fell like liquid fire, igniting entire forests in seconds. Landscapes burned. Villages vanished beneath waves of flame. From above, the destruction appeared decisive. But when the smoke cleared, the jungle always returned. Green crept back over the blackened earth, and with it, so did the enemy. Technology met nature and nature endured. Despite the overwhelming firepower, the war in Vietnam remained intensely personal. Small units moved slowly through dense foliage, every man dependent on the one right beside him. A single misstep could trigger a mine. A tripwire could unleash devastation without any warning. Fear became routine, not the sudden fear of a battle, but the constant, grinding fear of just waiting. Waiting for contact, waiting for movement, waiting for something unseen to decide your fate. At night, the jungle transformed. Flares would light up the darkness, casting twisted shadows across the trees and vines. Radios whispered coded messages. Distant gunfire echoed through the hills, and somewhere out there, beyond the perimeter, the enemy watched. Or maybe it was only the jungle itself moving. The difference was impossible to know. Sleep came in fragments. This war extended far beyond the battlefield. For the very first time, Americans watched a conflict unfold on their television screens. Images of wounded soldiers, burning villages, and fallen comrades entered living rooms all across the nation. The distance between the war and home completely collapsed. Vietnam became not just a military conflict, but a national reckoning. Victory became incredibly difficult to define. Territory gained one day was abandoned the next. Body counts replaced clear objectives. Numbers replaced meaning. The war continued not because it was being decisively won, but because it was so deeply difficult to end. Vietnam exposed a harsh truth. You cannot dominate what you cannot see. You cannot defeat an enemy who refuses to stand out in the open. And you cannot fight a war of shadows with the tools of certainty. As the years passed, morale eroded. The strain on the soldiers grew heavier. The psychological cost became impossible to ignore. When the helicopters finally lifted away for the last time, they didn't carry triumph. They carried exhaustion, confusion, and questions without any answers. The jungle closed in behind them, erasing their footprints as if nothing had ever happened. But something had changed forever. Vietnam reshaped how the United States fought wars and how it understood them. It forced a reckoning with the limits of power, the cost of invisibility, and the consequences of fighting an enemy embedded within the environment itself. This was not a war announced by grand invasions or declarations. It was a war that whispered. And long after the final helicopters departed, the echoes of Vietnam remained in the memories of those who fought, and in the conscience of a nation that learned the price of fighting a war it could never fully see. Thank you for watching. If you found this story compelling, please consider subscribing for more deep dives into history. We'll see you in the next one.